So firstly, when we talk about climate change and climate action, there are so many different narratives around this problem. And AI suffers the same problem. And so it depends on where you are situated in terms of how you articulate the issues and the problems and then find solutions. And everyone has a different lens, and that lens dictates how you frame those issues. So the dominant narratives around climate change are directed from the minority world. And this is really important because the solutions are then also driven by this minority world and applied to a majority context where the majority of the time it's not contextualized to their situation. And so the vast majority of people, particularly in the global south, who live on the land, who are local farmers, fishers, and Indigenous peoples, they continue to be excluded from these decisions. And worse, especially in Asia, they're being marginalized, oppressed, persecuted, and often killed for doing so. And so when we combine these two themes of climate change and AI in this context, we must contextualize solutions that actually fit that don't necessarily fit the common narrative, right? The dominant narrative. We need to think outside more broadly about what are the existing narratives. And there are sort of four aspects that I would like to raise. And the first one being the colonialism context when it comes to Indigenous peoples and their perpetual oppression from that. Looking at traditional ecological knowledge and the continued epistemicides of that knowledge, then we overlay those contexts and those existing contents around the climate agenda with technology. And so how does technology then play in terms of harms upon Indigenous rights within these contexts? And then specifically, I think what's really important is the gender aspect and how technology-facilitated gender-based violence is actually targeting and oppressing women, specifically women environmental defenders. So with that, if it's okay with you, I'll just go into those points and give a little bit of a presentation, and then we can open up to more discussions. So firstly, just to contextualize the generational expanse of colonialism and continued neocolonialism through relationships with existing nation states, which in Asia is particularly oppressed Indigenous peoples and denied them of their rights to self-determination, land and territories, which then results in a lack of access to resources. And securing the respect for and the recognition of this collective identity as Indigenous peoples, their ways of lives and customary institutions, it continues to be denied. And it's denied predominantly due to state and global political economies, which, as I say, are driven by wealthy nations. And even regardless of high-level conventions such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which many states are signatory to, they enshrine the rights to self-determination, to describe their own communities, to govern those communities themselves and make decisions about their communities, including membership and censorship, and decisions over their territories. But yet colonialism over the years has perpetually annihilated traditional cultures. And it has assimilated many of those cultures to colonial cultures. And so you see this quite prominently throughout Asia. And so nowadays, many Indigenous peoples no longer identify themselves as Indigenous. And this is because, one, they don't want to because it's not advantageous, or two, it's dangerous. And they don't feel that they are Indigenous anymore because they've been so culturally appropriated. In many circumstances, you see a hybrid identity of cultures where they appropriate aspects of colonial culture plus retaining traditional aspects of their culture. And so the other advent of that colonialism over the years is also the transition from predominantly matriarchal systems of governance, especially over conservation practices, and the transformation into more predominant patriarchal societies where men dominate conservation efforts. And this definitely reflects our current state of conservation, where it is predominantly male dominated. And so the roles of women and their contribution within conservation and environmental governance has been deteriorated over generations of this colonialism. And it's perpetually being undermined internally within their own communities, which have transitioned to more patriarchal societies, but also externally. And so this excludes their knowledge and their valuable contributions to conservation. And it's really this knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, as a term that I've used, that's used predominantly to describe Indigenous knowledge, which is growing in recognition now. So although we've had this long-standing oppression of this knowledge, there is greater recognition for it within the ICCC, which has now created a high-level working group to ensure that traditional ecological knowledge is captured and included in high-level political forums and environmental protection agendas. But yet, unfortunately, what this actually does is segregate and other that knowledge. So it actually segregates it from the mainstream agenda. So then, although it's appeasing and a nice to have for activists, it's actually focused on collecting that traditional knowledge without actually offering them the rights and understanding that traditional ecological knowledge is linked to their relationships, not only within their communities, but within their lands and territories. So it continues to deny Indigenous peoples of their rights to govern resources over lands. And by doing so, they also aren't able to interject their TEKs into mainstream discussions. And so ultimately this leads to segregation, othering of knowledge systems, discrimination and marginalization of TEK, the appropriation of that knowledge when it suits them to justify mainstream agendas, and also the epistemology, which most importantly then leads to the denial of self-determination rights. So one of the things we are doing in our program is to develop, and we have developed actually, an Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty framework for Asia, which collectively embodies some of the principles around what it would look like to embed traditional ecological knowledge to support the reclamation of Indigenous rights to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their data and as identities. So IKDS deliberately returns this control of the data back to Indigenous peoples and shifts the power imbalances, and is an evolving practice to start to decolonize some of these data ecosystem structures and empower governing structures over Indigenous data ecosystems and protect Indigenous data. So even though we're making these concerted efforts to strengthen Indigenous communities' data ecosystems in Asia, Indigenous peoples still remain profoundly underrepresented in the data ecosystems across Asia as producers, users, intermediaries, and identified subjects. So this lack of inclusion and representation is even greater for women. So when we set these two issues together in this historical context with systematic and institutionalized biases and discriminations, how can we start to then rectify these imbalances within digital technology systems, such as artificial intelligence, that doesn't actually mimic and perpetuate these existing colonialized structures, right? So if we look at technology as it's implemented now, there is a lot of discussion about the tech harms. We are currently heightenedly aware about the inequalities of how tech is being perpetuated throughout our society. And these debates are being discussed at quite high levels. However, most of the glaring human rights abuses associated with technologies such as AI are still not being addressed through the lens of how it oppresses Indigenous peoples. And these communities are neither existing within any of these systems, or nor are they engaged in their development, use, and application. So one of the main drivers for this oppression or continued oppression of Indigenous peoples in the tech lens is the proliferation of green tech, which has been touted as a solution and perpetuated throughout the region, which has already started to divest people of their fundamental human rights. So green tech is basically negligent within the environment. Green tech is actually revolving within the region, and it's setting up a stage for the annihilation of Indigenous presence within technology governing systems and their data and their identities within those data ecosystems. This is being highlighted in two ways, and I'm going to give these two case studies and I'll tie them together later. Firstly, digital public infrastructure and environmental data ecosystems and the governance of those ecosystems. So digital public infrastructure is ultimately controlled by governments and private firms. Indigenous peoples are often disconnected from these systems and not represented online. And this is mainly due to access, affordability, language, and ultimately technology doesn't play a large role in their cultures. So yet they're the most affected when states target them through digital rights violations, such as internet shutdowns and censorship. And this growing trend of constraints of freedom of expression and civic space has allowed digital infrastructure to further suppress their ability to exercise basic freedoms. And so a few case studies in Bangladesh, an Indigenous news outlet was targeted because they were reporting on violations of gang rape of women in the Chittagong hill tracts. In the Rakhine area of Western Myanmar, the genocide perpetrated by the junta, they used internet shutdowns to distill publicity around those events. In Vietnam, many activists, such as Mother Mushroom and other political activists on environmental issues, have been persecuted and placed in jail for being outspoken about environmental issues. Excuse me. So these examples are not necessarily AI issues, but it's an issue around centralization of infrastructure and control. And it's an issue that basically demonstrates that Indigenous communities have no agency within these technology systems. And even though they have very little access to it and use of it, any time they do use it as a tool to advocate for their rights, it's utilized against them. And so they're often really targeted. And most of this targeting is to maintain mainstream narratives around Indigenous peoples. So when we look at environmental data ecosystems and we think about environmental data, it's really in high demand at the moment. So we have huge, large-scale big data sets for imagery to localization of small-scale drones. All of this data is being accumulated, but fundamentally, it's disrespecting two fundamental principles of planetary ecosystems. And one is that the planet works holistically in harmony in that it's circular and doesn't distinguish between water and land, or atmosphere and energy, or biodiversity and climate. Yet the majority of our climate science in these data systems segregates these thematic areas into finite and distinct disciplines, and that they don't interact. And not only do they not interact with each other, they exclude human presence and the influence of humans upon those environmental systems. Obviously, this is starting to change in terms of the realization that we do need to broaden our understanding more and be more holistic in the way we're capturing data about our environments. But traditionally, this has always led to fortress conservation, which has been a major driver of human rights abuse, which has been the forced displacement of a lot of Indigenous communities and creating conflict globally. And it's very influenced by Western agendas and ideals of environmental management. It's very detached from holistic ecosystem management. So it's also very in stark contrast to Indigenous knowledge systems and their beliefs, where Indigenous worldviews and ways of knowing their environments are in harmony with their belief systems, which have protected their resources throughout time and space. So environmental data is also held externally from Indigenous peoples. It's also which makes it a fundamental rights issue, which is not only enshrined in various UN conventions, such as the UNDRIP, but within many national constitutions. By allowing large-scale imagery to be taken over Indigenous lands and territories and excluding them from the control of the classification, vocabulary, metadata, provenance of those data sets, it actually removes their rights to tenure, land tenure, and resources. So when the data is analyzed, even with machine learning and artificial intelligence, these rights are then further removed from them because they don't have any control over the algorithms. In both situations, Indigenous peoples should have the ability to interject who designs, owns, controls, uses, or benefits from both the human and non-human derived data. And I put a little caveat in here for the commodification of environmental data, and I can elaborate more on that. But lastly, I wanted to talk about the major accumulation of this data into privatized hands. And our planetary data is basically controlled by these private companies who have a lot of power in gathering this data, not only for the commodification of that data, but a large proportion of it is actually being used in military applications for surveillance and strategic military operations, which we see in the Pacific as causing exceptional harm to communities in terms of displacement and oppressions. And then I wanted to talk about technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And again, environmental defenders, particularly women, are being targeted and persecuted throughout the region. Digital surveillance, harassment, red tagging are amongst some of the crimes. So 2 examples of women that we work with are environmental journalists who have been persecuted through their outspoken advocacy efforts and have been able to seek justice for those oppressions. But many Indigenous peoples across Asia experience these harassments online and discrimination and censorship. And it's very unclear whether this is AI generated at this point in time. We know that during the Rakhine incidents and other incidences globally that it is generated AI chatbots, bots. But yet we're in this context of high-level censorship and oppressive authoritarian regimes within Asia, and Indigenous peoples are the ones that are being particularly targeted when they're being outspoken about environmental issues, and specifically women. And so when this is happening, when when content is being removed that Indigenous women or persons are putting forward, it actually influences their legitimacy. So they're trying to take down this knowledge from being broadly distributed and contributing to making better decisions around environmental management that would include them. To do so would necessitate access to rights, which many states are not willing to provide. But unfortunately, the circumstance for women is that it can be very violent. And these oppressive tactics then increase self-censorship, and it also decreases confidence levels of these women, because most environmental activists who are women also need to take care of their family and have a lot of that burden of family care as well. So it's very challenging for them to continue when they're facing these oppressions. So what we're trying to do is co-create spaces, digital spaces for women to share and learn, and to strengthen matriarchal systems of knowledge that already exist, and to heighten their legitimacy and infiltrate platforms of influence in order to effectively contribute to solutions. And so we have several projects in environmental governance for women that looks at how do we approach this through a co-creation process, and hopefully to also strengthen their rights to lands and territories. I'm just going to stop there for any questions.
Thank you so much.